Hey there, fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. If you're into stories that make your skin crawl and keep you up at night, then buckle up because this one's a doozy. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? The stories. This motel room voicemail rerouted search teams that winter. They kept saying it started with a motel room that smelled like old coffee and bleach, and with a voicemail nobody expected. The recordings came out in late winter after a storm knocked power across the county and kicked the motel phones awake again. Rhea Tavener was 37 and worked as an emergency coordinator for a spread-out mountain county that never felt ready. She had a habit of keeping paper maps rolled in a rubber band and a small camera tucked under her parka. That morning, she wanted only to rebalance commitments and check that the warming shelter had enough cots for the week. She planned to drive the Ridge Road, swing by the radio repeater, and be back before lunch. The incident started when the Nightlark Motel on the highway called the non-emergency line with a strange message they could not clear. The manager, a tired man named Cal Rudd, told the dispatcher that a red light on room 26 blinked, and the phone kept chiming. He said the display showed a new voicemail that would not delete, and he wanted someone to listen because the guest had left. Rhea took the secondary call because the sheriff's deputies were stacked with fender benders on the main grade. She arrived to find the lobby heater making a low metallic whine, and Cal behind a counter with a cracked bell. He slid the room key and nodded toward the outside corridor, his voice flat from too many nights at the same desk. Rhea used nitrile gloves from her field kit, then lifted the handset and dialed the code that the placard said would access messages. The voicemail opened with a tone and a computerized voice reading the timestamp in a clipped monotone. The date announced sounded like last night near 10, according to her quick notes scratched with a blunt pencil. The message that followed had the kind of audio that police technicians describe as close but muddy, and it made her shoulders rise. A woman whispered that a man was hurt, and she asked for help. Then she mentioned mile marker numbers and a guardrail that bent inward toward a runoff ditch. There was wind noise and the distant thrum of trucks, and what Rhea believed might be the quick chirp of a turn signal. The caller finished with words that sounded like two names, then a tired exhale, then silence long enough to raise goosebumps on her arms. By the time she walked back to the lobby, the dispatcher had already compared mile markers that matched those numbers on the East Highway spur. A search team was gathering at the fairgrounds with two four-wheelers and a county plow driver who knew every ditch by seat memory. Rhea signed the log and relayed what she heard, and her own words hardened into directions that sent good people toward a cold bend. An hour later, a second caller reached the tip line and said they had heard the same voicemail when calling the motel to complain about their refund. That person repeated the marker numbers and added that a dog barked once in the background, which persuaded the consensus further. Witness statements began clustering around the East Spur, and a deputy noted in the dispatch log that he had seen a bent guardrail near marker 32 2 days prior. The search teams rolled that way in a slow line of lights that looked brave against the blank sky. Rhea drove separately and scanned plow berms that faced the wind, because snow settles in patterns that trap fresh tire ruts longer. She told herself that the timestamp was clean, and that the voice felt close, and that people needed her to stay practical. The first mile produced a stranded sedan with a dead battery and a sheepish driver, and the second mile delivered a drift that swallowed half the lane. They found nothing that matched a serious wreck, only plastic shrapnel and a glove lost last week, which made her think about timing again. Back at the fairgrounds, a radio operator replayed the voicemail on a speaker, and the group leaned in. Rhea asked Cal for the motel's phone vendor contact, and he brought out a binder with hand-printed notes in thick marker. She called the vendor and asked about power cycles and about date behavior when the system lost time, and the technician promised to check archival events. She returned to the voicemail and listened for anything that placed a person rather than a highway, because people leave fingerprints in sound if you keep still. The second listen gave her something new that felt small but pointed. Right after the caller said the mile marker numbers, the wind changed tone for half a second, then a faint clack sounded like an elevator door. That did not belong near a rural guardrail, and it made her write elevator with a question mark next to it, which was not her usual habit. She also caught the soft bleep of a room keycard reader, which could have been the motel hallway if the phone had been on speaker, or a different building entirely. She left the fairgrounds and drove back to the Nightlark with the camera on the seat, planning to map every sound in the hallway against her memory. Cal mentioned that room 26 sat above the ice machine and that the elevator had a sticky door that made a little clap. She asked who stayed in that room last night, and his ledger showed a single occupancy, paid in cash, by someone who wrote a name that did not match any local license. He shrugged and said the guest checked out at 6 and that housekeeping already turned the room. Rhea asked to see the housekeeping cart, and the housekeeper, a careful woman named Jillian North, said she had found the room tidy. Jillian said the phone had been off the hook at first, which she corrected, and she said the window faced the back lot where trucks idled. Rhea asked if anyone had used the lobby phone when power returned, and Jillian said a traveler borrowed it while waiting for a ride that morning. That detail felt important because lobby phones sometimes route through the same server as the room phones, which can create strange behavior. The vendor called back and reported that their server recorded an abnormal offset during the storm, which could shift timestamps for local voicemail. He said the system fell back to a factory clock tied to a different zone, and then resynced once the internet returned, which can mislabel messages. He promised to send a small report, and Rhea wrote down the gist, then underlined the word offset because she disliked anything that moved signposts during a search. The dispatcher added a note in the log with that information, and the group paused to reassess direction. Rhea listened again and measured the gaps between key clicks and the turn signal chirp, and she kept hearing something like a vending machine compressor. She stepped into the hallway and held her phone down by the ice machine, and her recording later showed the same humming cadence. The voicemail might not have been a live plea from a ditch, but could instead be a message recorded in the building and then captured by the motel system during the storm. She asked Cal whether any old messages archived on the server could return as new after a reset. Cal admitted that he had once lost all messages after a lightning strike and then found them again as new after a technician visit. He said the phone guy joked about ghosts calling back to settle their bills, which did not sound funny to Rhea at that moment. She pressed for dates and asked whether past incidents lined up with heavy weather, and he nodded toward a clipboard full of repair tickets. The dates matched cold weeks when snow slid from the roof, and the idea of an old message waking up felt more likely with each line. The next step was to figure out who had left the recording, and whether the details pointed to the East Spur or somewhere entirely different. Rhea asked for prior registration cards for room 26, and Cal produced a stack bound with a rubber band that snapped on the counter. She gently sorted through and found a multi-night stay from late last winter under a name that also did not match a license. The rate was discounted for cash, and the note column said, "Truck Lot View," which fit the sound of idling engines in the message. She then called the State Patrol office and asked for any incidents last winter that involved a bent guardrail near any similar marker numbers. The trooper on duty searched reports and told her there had been a slide-off on the West Highway spur near marker 32 during a storm in late February. He said the driver had fled before dawn, and a passing snowplow called it in, and the car was recovered later without injuries, according to the archived calls. That wreck would have put a person back in town by breakfast, and possibly in a motel room across from trucks. Rhea returned to the audio and timed the interval between the words and the faint elevator clap, and then timed the lobby elevator with her own phone recording. The match was not perfect, but close enough that a court would likely call it consistent under ordinary conditions, according to her training notes. She also realized the turn signal chirp probably belonged to a guest being dropped at the front door, not a car on the highway. The dog bark could have been a pet in the lot, which often happens near the vending area after check-in. She asked the radio operator to broadcast a simple clarification and to slow the east spur sweep while a second team checked the west. The deputy, who remembered the bent rail on the east, admitted he might have mixed the side of the county in his earlier note, which happens when shifts run long. The west team found the old repair spot with fresh snow around the posts and an evidence marker for a past accident half buried under ice. It seemed the voicemail referenced a prior event that had already closed, and their winter storm had wrapped it in new confusion. Rhea then visited the neighboring diner, where the night shift sometimes noticed details people forgot to hide, and she asked about the guest who paid in cash. The server, a college student named Del Finch, said a man sat alone near the window around 9, then stepped outside to take a call. Dell remembered because the man cupped his hand over the motel phone receiver in the lobby, which struck Dell as old-fashioned, and then asked for a ride to the bus station. That would place the phone call inside the building. During the same hour, the voicemail claimed she requested the motel camera footage for the hallway by room 26, and Cal said the system stored 2 weeks, which happened to straddle their storm. The timestamp on the clip showed a flicker at 9:58, right before the server saw the man on the lobby phone, which made her careful notes lean toward a local recording. A county technician extracted the audio from the clip, and while it was muddy, a mechanical ding from the elevator landed exactly where her earlier timing suggested. The odds of a live highway recording sharing those indoor sounds felt very small. The twist arrived quietly when the vendor finally sent logs that showed the voicemail database replayed queued items after resyncing and labeled some as new. One item matched a stored call from late winter last year that had been partially corrupted, then reconstructed during the reboot. The metadata showed room 26 as the destination for that older call, which explained the light and the stubborn message and made the puzzle sad rather than sinister. The message people heard belonged to a different night and a different problem that resolved without tragedy, and it had been pulled forward by a storm. Rhea wrote a summary for the incident file that emphasized the difference between live audio and replayed audio, then highlighted the risks during outages. She recommended an added step where dispatch confirms time against independent sources when a tip arrives through a system that just recovered. She also asked the motel to change their default message code and to put a note by the desk to call her office if room phones behave oddly after storms. Cal agreed and added a bright sticker to the binder with her number, which made her smile despite the long day. The search teams returned after noon with tired faces and a neat inventory, and they ate chili from a crock that steamed the fairgrounds office. Rhea thanked each person by name and reminded them that a wrong turn during a fast morning did not mean a bad job. She said the lesson was about signals and systems, and about winter technology that lies twice, and everyone nodded while they warmed their hands. She filled out the reimbursement forms for fuel and gloves and slid the packet into the outgoing tray with a note for finance. In the evening, she sat at her kitchen table with the paper map unfurled and marked the motel with a small circle. She added a line toward the west spur and penciled in the marker numbers with a question mark to reflect how close memory can sit to fact. She listened to the voicemail one last time through headphones, and this time the vending machine compressor sounded obvious enough that she wondered how she missed it earlier. Fatigue makes patterns where there are none, and urgency can turn a whisper into a highway without much effort. A week later, the vendor installed a firmware update that locked time against a battery backup so power glitches could not shift anything. The sheriff added a line to the dispatch checklist about confirming independent clocks, and the radio operator taped a bold reminder above the console. Jillian named the ice machine Manny as a joke in the break room because it hummed in the same rhythm as the recording. Dell laughed and said the elevator still clapped, but only when someone shoved a luggage cart too hard against the door. In a different winter years ago, the same storm pattern had toppled a repeater and blacked out an entire valley, which lived in Rhea's head. She thought about that while walking past a wall of snow tools at the supply shed, and she decided to put spare batteries for hotel systems on the grant list. It felt like a small change inside a big map, and that was how she survived seasons that piled risk on top of routine tasks. She pinned the grant idea to her bulletin board and wrote a short sentence that read, "Verify time before direction." No one ever found the man who left the cash registration during the recent night because he boarded the bus and vanished into ordinary life. The earlier driver from last winter had been located and fined, according to the archived paperwork, which made that thread tidy in the official sense. The county slid back into the rhythm of plows and calls and an occasional lost tourist, and the motel phones stayed quiet except for room wake-ups. The red light over room 26 stopped blinking, and the ice machine chugged along with stubborn loyalty. Rhea kept the pencil notes in a folder labeled with the motel name and the date and included a copy of the vendor logs. She handed a training copy to the new deputy class and asked them to listen once without context, then again with the building map. The exercise worked because people learned how easily a detail snaps a hunch in half, and how worth it is to test every hunch. They left with a habit of checking other clocks before sending trucks into the cold, which is the sort of habit that quietly saves lives. By late spring, the guardrail on the west spur reflected the sun with a fresh coat of paint, and the plow berms had slipped away. The fairgrounds chili pot was replaced with a cooler of sports drinks, and the radio chatter turned toward camping permits and picnic warnings. Nobody brought up the voicemail during the season kickoff meeting, but everyone remembered the morning they chased a ghost along the east spur. The minutes simply read "Time Verification Protocol Updated," which looked small on paper and felt big in practice. People who were not there will say it was obvious from the start, and they will wonder why teams moved before verifying. People who were there remember the tone in that whisper, and the way good intentions sprint when wind hits the valley wrong. Rhea thinks the truth sits between those angles, and that winter rewards humility more than certainty, especially when phones and storms share a stage. She wrote that in the margin of her map, in handwriting that tilted uphill like a person leaning into a cold night. When she passed the Nightlark one afternoon with the window cracked, she heard the elevator clap echo through the empty corridor. It sounded like a period at the end of a long sentence that finally made sense, and she let the thought linger until the highway bent. The motel squatted back into its season of travelers who just need a warm bed and a snow-free path to the door. The voicemail lived on in a folder, and in the way the county listened to machines, and in the simple habit of checking the time. The stories. Paramedic returned a ring to this hospital wing. The ring sat in a small evidence pouch with a folded intake label, and the label named "This Hospital Wing." Security logged the delivery in the overnight book with a careful time, and they filmed the handoff at the ambulance bay. Calder Ruiz was 34, and he worked nights on a private ambulance that covered the mixed urban fringe. He drove a high-mileage rig with a sticky rear latch, and he kept a quiet notebook under the dash. He finished paperwork after sunrise when the cafeteria coffee tasted burnt and the elevators finally ran without packed gurneys. His simple plan for this morning made sense, and it fit the tired mood of the shift. He would drop the ring, sign the property line, and clock out before the traffic built. The ring was a plain yellow band with a shallow engraving, and the engraving read LK and May 14. He did not remember any patient who mentioned jewelry, and their overnight calls were ordinary transfers and one shortness of breath. The band came from under the bench cushion during cleanup, and he spotted it when a pen rolled and tapped. He pocketed the pouch because it felt wrong to leave it, and he headed for the East Wing desk. The East Wing used to hold telemetry and a step-down, and now it served as a rehab overflow when beds ran tight. The desk kept a property log from older times, and the same binder continued through years of tape and patchwork pages. The unit clerk looked at the label and frowned, and she called for the charge nurse by habit. The charge nurse checked the overnight admits and shook her head, and she said nothing matched a ring for this wing. She asked which patient lost it, and he told her none of their patients mentioned a ring at all. She said they could place it in central security, and they would open a claim if anyone asked later. He nodded but felt a tug, and the label still named this wing in plain handwriting. He asked if the desk ever handled stray property like that, and the charge nurse said it occasionally happened. A maintenance tech leaned from a ladder and listened, and he said the East Wing had its own ghosts by reputation. He laughed when the nurse shot a look, and he added that he meant the cardboard kind. He explained that old property envelopes sometimes turned up behind cabinets, and housekeeping would move them along. He said linens and small items traveled strange paths when movers closed floors, and people forgot until someone asked later. Calder thanked him, then he asked permission to check the binder for older notations. The clerk slid it over and pointed to a rule that said deliveries needed 2 staff signatures. The binder held thick pages with names and room numbers, and some entries noted patient transfers to other wings. Calder skimmed recent weeks and then months, and nothing showed the initials LK, or any ring notes. He asked if the wing ever logged items that did not belong to current patients, and the clerk said rarely. She remembered a wedding band that fell through a bed frame on a weekend, and it took months to track. She said a therapist found it during a lift motor replacement, and the family cried when they got the call. The clerk shrugged and said the hospital felt like a moving chest of drawers, and odds and ends migrated forever. Calder walked to security with the pouch, and the guard on duty scanned the label with a handheld. The guard said the pouch style looked older, and the zip strip color was not used anymore. The guard printed the receipt and asked for a description. and Calder gave the engraving as clearly as possible. The guard searched a property database and found no ring tickets for the wing, and his search covered 2 years by default. Calder asked if there were archived losses in older years, and the guard said records before 2014 were scanned PDFs. The guard called upstairs and requested access to a shared drive, and the wait felt like a small eternity. Calder stood under the camera bubble and reviewed his shift notes, and the notes listed 4 dispatch times with addresses redacted here. He wrote a short line about a transfer from a rehab floor with a pleasant dog calendar, and he wrote another about a night custodian who kept a radio. None of the lines mentioned a ring, and none of the patients wore jewelry in obvious ways. He opened his phone gallery and checked the bench photo he took for restocking, and the timestamp matched their return to the bay. The ring did not appear in that picture, and the bench looked clean and dull. He wondered if the ring slid loose after the photo when the rig shuddered, and the thought did not settle his nerves. The guard waved him back and offered a chair, and they opened a folder of ripped black and white scans. One report flagged an incident in the East Wing, and the date read May 14 of 2010. The note said a patient property bag failed during a bed change, and a ring listed as L.K. went missing. The report said staff searched the room, and linen hampers were checked in central processing. A second note added that the family could not be reached, and a voicemail box stayed full for weeks. The case closed without resolution, and the scan ended with a faded stamp that looked handmade. Calder felt the small click that happens when separate lines meet, and the label suddenly seemed heavier than its weight. He asked if the room number was legible, and the guard zoomed until the pixels turned into blocks. The number looked like 212 or 217, and the wing layout had changed since then. The guard said maintenance might have an old map, and a shop supervisor kept binders in a cage downstairs. Calder thanked him, and he asked to make a quick copy of the scan for his crew file. The guard printed the page and stamped a copy line, and he urged Calder to keep things simple with the wing. On the loading dock, a housekeeper pushed a rolling cart, and she mentioned hearing about a ring on the radio. She said her aunt worked here years ago as a transporter, and her aunt remembered a family who asked about LK. The aunt thought LK stood for Lena Kovacs, and that name showed up on a donor plaque somewhere. The housekeeper stressed that it was just a memory, and people mixed up stories after long shifts. Calder thanked her and asked which plaque she meant, and she guessed it could be by the therapy gym. He made a note with a star, and he promised nothing beyond a respectful check. Maintenance loaned him a binder with a taped spine, and the old East Wing diagram showed rooms from 190 to 230. A paper tab marked a wall removal year in 2005, and the spaces had been reconfigured since that renovation. The diagram showed linen chutes and mechanical closets, and one chute lined up behind the current rehab gym. Calder compared the faded room to a modern corner, and the old room 212 would be near the therapy office. He felt the workable line appear, and it had more gears than luck. He thanked the supervisor and returned the binder, and he set off toward the gym. The therapy office had a bulletin board with service pins, and a small photo showed a woman in scrubs named Kovacs. A caption said she ran a staff fundraiser in 2011, and the photo looked like a copy of a copy. Calder asked the receptionist if Miss Kovacs still worked there, and the receptionist said she retired years ago. The receptionist checked a directory and found no current contact, and then she opened a drawer with old alumni notes. She found a folded program from a memorial tea, and the newsletter said, Lena Kovacs lost a husband early. The print used careful language, and it did not mention the ring or the initials. Calder felt a chill that did not belong to superstition, and he asked security if he could call the number on the old scan. The guard said the number probably died years ago, and he recommended the hospital volunteer office for family links. Calder went there and explained the situation, and he kept details minimal and careful. The volunteer coordinator listened and nodded, and then she showed him a book of donor inscriptions. She pointed at a plaque near the rehab gym, and the name said, Kovacs Family Therapy Garden with a small leaf icon. She said the family sometimes visited during late summer, and she could pass a message through a general email. Calder returned to the East Wing desk and asked again to log the ring, and he added the old report number on the form. The charge nurse read his notes and raised an eyebrow, and she asked whether this was a lost patient or a lost object? Calder answered it was certainly an object, and he was trying to avoid making anyone hurt again. She stared at the band through the plastic and then nodded, and she initialed the line for custody. She called linen services and requested a search of older chutes, and she asked maintenance about a recent vibration test nearby. She then told Calder she appreciated the thoroughness and she would add her number to the receipt. On his lunch break that arrived at almost noon, Calder called his partner from the shift and asked about the bench cushion. His partner said the cushion ripped months ago near the latch, and small things sometimes fell into that hollow void. He said he once lost a pen that rolled out 3 weeks later, and they both laughed about the gremlins. Calder asked if any hospital staff had borrowed their transport stretcher recently, and his partner said rehab used it during a power test yesterday. The partner said the rehab techs pushed the stretcher over a threshold that made the whole thing shudder. Calder pictured the ring jumping free inside the cushion, and the moment drew a simple line through time. He walked to biomedical engineering and asked about the rehab stretcher loan, and the tech on duty pulled an asset report. The report showed a loan to the East Wing therapy office, and the return time matched their arrival last night. The tech said the stretcher had a known rattle in the side rail, and small items could migrate if they slipped. Calder requested permission to inspect the rail, and the tech handed over a hex key with a cautious smile. He removed the end cap and tipped the rail, and a dust mix fell with a soft hiss. Nothing else emerged, and the ring hypothesis remained just that. And yet, it still felt reasonable. Calder tried laundry services next and asked whether a ring could travel from a chute to a truck and back. The supervisor said it happened rarely, and a ring could ride a torn bag to a cart and escape later. The supervisor said older chutes sometimes released surprises when motors kicked, and vibration made lost things walk. She said one time a pager chimed from a folded blanket, and everyone jumped because the model was ancient. She wrote down the ring details and promised to ask her staff, and she asked for the property receipt number. Calder thanked her and climbed the stairs because the elevator seemed suddenly crowded. A retired nurse named Myra arrived for a flu shot, and she recognized the old pouch design at the east desk. She said those pouches vanished after 2012, and she used to seal them with a blue strip. She looked at the initials and stopped, and she softly said Lena kept her maiden name for work. She remembered a shift when a patient requested a chaplain, and afterward a ring went missing from the bag. She said they turned the room upside down and found nothing, and she cried telling the family that week. She asked whether the ring was truly here now, and the charge nurse said it was in security as of this morning. Calder asked whether Myra could share a statement, and she agreed to write a short note with dates as best she could. Her handwriting looked steady for a long history, and she described a bed change and a linen swap. She recalled a code earlier that day in a nearby room, and equipment had moved through the hallway quickly. She said carts piled up while everyone managed the chaos, and the chute doors swung as orderlies cleared hampers. She noted that Lena worked that corridor and often stayed late, and she kept paperwork near the therapy office. Myra ended by saying the family did not push a complaint, and the grief felt huge enough already. Calder added the note to the property file, and he asked security to copy the PDF and the asset report. The guards stapled everything carefully and wrote a short chain of custody line, and then he called his supervisor. The supervisor arrived and listened without interruption, and he nodded at each small connective piece. He said it sounded plausible that the ring traveled by linen or by stretcher rail, and the return timing fit. He asked whether anyone had reached the Kovacs family, and the volunteer office answered that a general email was sent. He decided the ring should be placed with the wing director for now, and then returned when the family responded. Calder walked the ring to the wing director with the charge nurse, and the director unlocked a small safe by the desk. The director read the file twice and looked out at the therapy gym, and he seemed to count years without words. He thanked Calder for not turning this into a story beyond the facts, and he said the path felt honest. He said sometimes the building kept tiny traps from old renovations, and objects slid back into daylight when ready. He placed the ring pouch on a velvet pad, and he wrote the time and his name with a careful hand. He said they would hold the ring in the wing, and they would make sure the right people heard. That afternoon, a volunteer returned with a printed email, and the message contained a phone number that still worked. The director asked Calder to stay as a witness, and they called the number on speaker in a quiet office. A woman answered and identified herself as Mira, and she said she was Lena's niece by marriage. She listened to the summary and asked a few precise questions, and her voice shook on the second. She said her aunt still wore a thin band and a chain, and this sounded like her husband's original ring. She said the family visited the garden plaque every May, and they never stopped asking about a lost ring. They met in a neutral conference room with frosted glass, and the director set the pouch on the table. Mira brought a small photo from 2010, and the ring in the picture looked like the one in the pouch. She asked to hold it for a moment, and then she breathed as if she had been underwater too long. She pointed to a tiny scratch on the inner edge, and it matched a bike fall from their early years together. She explained that the initials were his and hers, and the date marked the wedding by a justice in a quiet office. She thanked the room and said she did not want a ceremony, and she was just grateful for care. Calder signed the witness line and pushed the pen toward the director, and the moment felt weightless and plain. Mira asked whether anyone would mind if she visited the therapy garden, and the director offered to walk her there. She asked if the ring could remain with the wing for a little while, and she wanted to place flowers first. The director said the wing would be honored, and he promised to contact her if any details surfaced later. Calder stood back and watched the distance between grief and closure collapse, and it looked like a hallway finally cleared. He nodded to the charge nurse and pocketed his notebook, and he promised to replace the bench cushions soon. 2 days later, the linen supervisor called Calder and said a tech found a torn seam in the stretcher cover. The tear ran along a hidden edge that opened under vibration, and small things could hide there without notice. The tech also found a coin lodged deep inside, and its date hit the same era noted in the file. The supervisor said this was not proof of the ring path, and it felt like a friendly witness. Calder took a picture of the seam and added it to the binder, and he logged the maintenance request for replacement. The small chain of custody now included the rail and the cover, and the line grew stronger without pretending certainty. The wing director arranged a short gathering by the therapy garden, and a few staff who remembered Lena came by. They set a small card that said, "Returned to the East Wing," and they left space for a family decision. Mira arrived with her 2 cousins and a bouquet, and she asked if she could speak to the gathered staff. She thanked everyone for treating the story with hands open, and she said the ring could stay displayed for 1 week. After that week, she would take it home, and she would bring it back every May as a quiet practice. People nodded because the balance felt right, and the garden bench caught the late light gently. Calder watched from the edge with his coffee, and he remembered the pin that tapped the bench before he saw the ring. He thought about the way buildings hold on to things, and how people read meaning into dust and echo. He thought about dispatch logs that look cold until someone traces them, and then the script becomes a real day. He considered the lines that join strangers into an honest arc, and he respected each break where evidence speaks. The ring did not prove fate, and it did prove persistence, and it showed that care can be methodical. He left the garden before the applause faded, and he headed for the bay to start another shift. On his next overnight run, he noticed the new bench cushion, and it no longer swallowed dropped pens into hiding. He kept his notebook on the dash and wrote a line about the East Wing, and he kept the words simple. He wrote that a ring once traveled the hospital like a seed on wind, and the wind finally stopped here. He wrote that people made that stop happen by checking maps and calling quietly, and by not rushing a story. He wrote that the wing felt different now, and the difference came from patience more than any grand event. He closed the book and turned on the radio, and the night answered with the ordinary sound of work. Weeks later, the director sent a copy of a small framed note, and it now sat by the garden plaque. The note stated that a staff family recovered a long-missing ring, and it had rested here for a time. It stated that the return involved a paramedic, a clerk, a guard, a supervisor, and a retired nurse. It added that the file included a torn stretcher cover and a scan dated May 14 of 2010. It invited no legend and made no claim beyond the chain of quotes and receipts, and it felt right that way. Calder clipped the note into a shift binder and smiled, and then he got called out for a routine transfer. On the way past the East Wing doors, he slowed and looked in, and the desk lamp made the binder glow. The charge nurse raised a hand without words, and the unit seemed calm in the bright noon. He thought again about how evidence moves on small wheels and how the best stories stay quiet when finished. He considered how many families carry unclosed lines and how sometimes a lost object can stitch one shut. He knew this ring did not solve grief, and it gave shape to a memory that had gone thin with years. He swung the rig into the daylight and felt the road through the wheel, and the city rolled forward like usual. Months later, he learned that Mira returned each May with flowers, and she touched the glass with the ring inside. The volunteer office kept the file updated in a narrow drawer, and the drawer label read East Wing Recoveries. Security replaced the camera bubble over the bay and kept the old unit for parts, and they joked about relics. The maintenance supervisor finally tossed the torn cover after documenting it, and he felt oddly proud of the careful record. The hospital moved through another winter without big headlines, and the garden kept the same soft wind under the windows. Calder kept working nights and never chased mention, and the crew understood without any speech at all. He still told new hires one short version during checkout, and he kept the details clear of romance. He said a ring with initials LK turned up under a bench after a stretcher loan, and the label named this wing. He said the date on the old report matched the engraving, and the linen path explained the long delay. He said good records and patient calls made the circle close, and that promise is why they log everything. He said someone cried without making a scene, and that is how truth usually presents itself at work. Then he pointed to the property pouch drawer and the fresh bench cushion, and he told them to check twice. Calder visited the garden once more after a busy night, and he stood alone before the building woke completely. He watched sun slide across the plaque letters until the leaf icon warmed, and the quiet felt unearned and good. He thought of how small choices build bridges that do not announce themselves, and then one step reveals the span. He remembered a retired nurse who wrote a careful line and a housekeeper who shared a family guess. He remembered a guard who kept files neat and a director who knew not to fill silence. He placed his palm on the cool railing and chose no grand meaning, and he simply wished everyone a gentle day. The ring returned to this hospital wing by documented steps, and the steps were ordinary and human and steady. The story did not need a mystery beyond time and movement, and it showed how rooms keep modest promises. He considered that a bench cushion, a torn cover, and a faded scan can hold a family together again. He thought that is enough for any place built to heal, and he walked back to the bay without speaking. He started the rig and checked the lights, and the reflections blinked across the wet asphalt. He breathed, then he rolled toward the morning traffic, and the work met him with the same quiet weight. The stories. Why the bridge cameras failed during the final crossing. The countdown to the final crossing had been promoted for weeks, and the city promised a clean archived stream. The bridge cameras blinked to black when the convoy rolled, and people kept asking why the goodbye moment vanished. Kira Mendez was 32, and she worked as a municipal traffic systems technician for a mid-river city. Her plan that night was simple, and it involved checking status lights and saving a complete recording of the closure. The steel truss bridge was due for retrofit at midnight, and the transportation office wanted a neat farewell video. She had coffee in a paper cup, and she had a clipboard that made her look official to crews. The incident started 5 minutes before midnight when the feeds showed minor pixelation on the west pylon camera. A few seconds later, the screen tiles on her software wall went gray, and a red banner said signal lost. The last frame showed reflective letters on a banner near the railing and a shuttle bus idling behind a pilot car. The convoy began its slow roll toward the county line, and the control room got very quiet. Kira listened to the archived radio channel, and she heard the bridge supervisor saying to hold speed at 15. A dispatcher replied that news crews were filming from the Riverwalk, and the supervisor said that everyone needed to stay behind the cone. Then the audio captured a short, static burst, and another voice asked if the city still had their picture. The answer was a dry negative, and keyboard taps filled the silence that followed. Witnesses later said the outage was 8 minutes long, and it began as the pilot car reached the crown. A retired custodian named Gideon Pruitt told a reporter that he saw a cabinet in the median flicker. He said it looked like a tiny lightning bug behind the vent slots, and he heard a faint pop like a knuckle crack. His statement landed in an inbox with 3 other messages that said similar things about a brief blue blink. Kira started with the basics, and she pulled logs from the camera management server without touching the lost files. The server thought midnight arrived twice, which never looks good to anyone who has chased timing bugs. She found a warning about an NTP source flap, and the system switched to a GPS puck after losing the building clock. Timing drift can smear security recordings, yet it rarely knocks every feed offline at the exact same minute. She wrote a note that said timing is a clue, not a cause, and she kept digging with patience. The routers showed a spanning tree reconvergence at 4 seconds to midnight, and that got her attention fast. Spanning tree is a safety net that prevents a network from burning itself with a loop, and reconvergence takes time. She called the on-call network tech, a quiet guy named Rowan, and they met at the riverfront cabinet. They opened the cabinet with a city key, and they found a 4-port portable switch with gaffer tape on it. The little device sat between the city gear and a coil of orange cable that led under the guardrail. That was not standard kit. And the tape had a logo from a production company that Kira did not recognize. She photographed the layout, and she unplugged nothing until she finished a full set of angles for the file. Rowan traced the orange cable to a tent where a drone crew had packed cases, and the crew had already left. A security guard named Pavel Rios remembered a friendly woman in a blue jacket asking for power earlier that evening. Pavel said the team wanted to pull a clean feed for a big screen on the Riverwalk, and he pointed to a scuffed outlet strip. His witness statement sounded careful, and he signed the page with a slow, blocky hand. Kira compared the cabinet photos to her notes, and she noticed a second cable on a different VLAN. Someone had bridged the camera network to an admin line, which would let frames fly in circles until the tree shut ports. The timeline fit the gray tiles, and the 8-minute blackout matched the reconvergence delay for a loop across 2 closets. She still needed a trigger for the exact moment, and she did not like guessing when the city would ask for answers. She pulled dispatch logs for the Riverwalk power requests, and she listened to the whole night at double speed. A call at 11:59 reported a countdown clock failing near the viewing area, and a worker asked for a different outlet. Another call at the same minute said a heater had kicked on inside the west cabinet despite a warm night. That heater was a rack warm-up coil used since 2014 to protect hardware in winter, and it drew more than a camera. Rowan frowned at the heater line item, and he pointed to a value on the UPS history that showed a short overload. The little UPS carried the camera injectors and the microwave backhaul radio, and it did not love sudden guests. If the countdown clock plug shared a breaker with the injectors, the draw would push the UPS near its limit for a moment. Near the limit plus a loop is a bad hand, and the loop always wins, because the network saves itself by dropping links. Kira walked the Riverwalk the next morning, and she talked to 2 vendors who had rolled up cords at dawn. One vendor said a volunteer offered a splitter when the big screen lost power, and he remembered the splitter had city tape. Another vendor said the drone crew asked where the cabinet breaker was because their screen kept blinking, and nobody had the answer. The statements were casual, yet they matched the strange dance of power and packets near midnight. She asked the production company for a contact, and a polite manager called her back after lunch with a careful tone. He said their contractor had used a small switch to monitor the public feed, and they believed it was harmless. He said they never intended to touch city networks beyond a documented monitor port, and they had emails to show that fact. He sounded worried, as if lawyers had taught his throat to stay narrow, and he promised to send photos from setup. The photos arrived in compressed form, and they showed a neat tent with a truss and a folding monitor. A cable labeled monitor led toward the guardrail, and a second cable labeled power ran to the same cabinet. The setup looked tidy under good light, and a laminated badge on a case matched the tape Kira had photographed in the cabinet. She added the images to her folder, and she kept the tone neutral in every note she wrote. She still needed to explain the last pieces, and the final footage angle kept bothering her with its reflection. The last frame from the west camera showed a bright banner near the railing, and the letters looked metallic and sharp. A sign vendor later confirmed that the city changed materials at the last minute, and they used mylar for a brighter look. Mylar near a microwave dish is not a great neighbor, and the backhaul radio sat a few feet behind that railing. Kira climbed the tower stairs with Rowan, and they checked the dish for scuffs or misalignment under gentle wind. The dish was tight, and the cable made a clean loop that would please any inspector who had seen careless work. A scratch along the feed horn matched Gideon's tiny lightning bug description, and Rowan thought a brief arc could have happened. He said a floating ground could arc when a heater kicked in, while a loop forced the switch to rethink its links. They looked at the UPS again, and they saw a time-stamped blip that coincided with the heater line he had noticed earlier. A ground strap near the cabinet door had fresh tool marks, as if someone loosened, then tightened, then loosened again. Pavel remembered a worker with a silver badge checking the strap during the day, and he believed the badge looked temporary. He did not accuse anyone, and he did not embellish, and that made his memory feel steadier with time. A radio hobbyist named Lana Cho sent Kira a short audio clip from her scanner, and it included an interesting fragment. A voice said, "We lost it again, right at 0, and another voice replied, "The mirror banner is killing the dish angle." The clip had the squeal of an open mic, and it included a shout for someone to move the sign immediately. Lana kept the original recording, and she dated it from a receiver with a time reference she maintained carefully. Kira built a timeline that started with setup and ended with the convoy reaching the county line under flashing beacons. The drone crew plugged a small switch to a cabinet monitor port, and they also hit a convenience outlet to power their screen. The countdown team later borrowed that same outlet for a clock, and someone added a splitter that pushed the UPS near the cliff. At the same minute, a heater coil cycled. The loop between camera and admin lines forced Spanning Tree to rewire the network. The microwave backhaul radio tried to hold modulation, while the dish saw Mylar flash from a waving banner over the railing. A brief arc at the horn marked the overload moment, and the UPS shrugged as the injectors cycled in self-defense. The network dropped non-essential links until the tree calmed, and the cameras starved for power while the bus rolled by. 8 minutes later, everything recovered, and the last frames returned to a quiet bridge with only taillights in the distance. She tested the theory instead of declaring it solved, and she set up a controlled loop with a spare cabinet. Rowan brought a portable switch and a splitter, and they hooked a dummy clock and a space heater to simulate draw. They hung a sheet of Mylar behind a small dish, and they watched link lights as the UPS meter leaned into the red. The picture dropped in a pattern that matched the outage graph, and the recovery time was nearly the same as the archived gap. The city attorney asked for careful wording, and Kara kept her report plain and rooted in the logs and statements. She wrote that the outage was caused by a loop introduced by a third-party device connected to a cabinet switch. She wrote that concurrent power draw caused a protective brownout on the injector bank, and the Mylar reflection reduced backhaul margin. She wrote that the combination aligned at the convoy start and the system behaved as designed to protect itself. There were no villains in the file, and there were only decisions that stacked until one more decision leaned on the pile. The production company paid an invoice for a review of future practices, and they issued a short apology that avoided dramatic language. The city barred portable switching devices from cabinets without written permits, and they posted a plain sign that said, "Do not plug in here." The Riverwalk now had a dedicated outlet post with a meter and a breaker that belonged to special events. Kira saved the last recovered frames in a folder marked Final Moments after the fact, and she kept a second copy offline. She did not watch them often, and she did not chase blame in private, and she slept fine despite a long week. The bridge sulked under scaffolding and tarps for months, and the retrofit finished in a crisp morning 2 years later. People cheered during the reopening, and the cameras held their picture while the first car drifted over the new deck. Later, she visited Gideon at the Riverwalk, and he pointed at the sunset like a man who graded light for a living. He said he liked the quiet after a big repair, and he liked how the river never cared about the drama. Kira laughed, and she said the river had better uptime than most networks she had nursed through storms. He nodded once, and he said the city should write that motto on the cabinet door in permanent black paint. The final crossing remained a story without visuals, and it turned into a local trivia question about timing and luck. People asked why the cameras failed at that exact moment, and she would answer with the same simple sentence. The cameras did not fail. The system protected itself when we pushed it into a corner with too many little choices. It was not sabotage, and it was not a conspiracy, and it was not a broken promise carved in steel. That answer never made headlines, and it never satisfied anyone who needed a single dramatic cause to tie a bow. Yet it was true enough for a file labeled complete, and it was sturdy enough to stand in front of questions. She believed that was all a public story needs, and she believed that was enough to close a small and stubborn loop. The river kept moving, the bridge returned to work, and the cabinets hummed in their careful metal boxes by the rail. The stories. This tape from the lake wasn't meant for you. The box of tapes arrived with a smell like wet cardboard and cold metal, which fit the labels scrawled across the top. The handwriting said property of lakeside maintenance, and under that a warning marker in red that felt a little performative. Ria Kovac was 34 and paid by the city to digitize old media back into living memory, which meant long headphones days. She sat in a windowless room behind the reference desk and fed cassettes into a deck that clicked with patient devotion. Her plan for the day was not ambitious, just finish a carton before her lunch sandwich bled through the paper. The incident began when she lifted a cassette from the stack with tape flaking like dandruff across the shell and saw the note. Someone had written this tape from the lake was not meant for you in the same heavy hand that marked the box. She laughed by herself. Then she rubbed the shell with a sleeve and slotted it into the dubbing deck. The first sound was wind on an exposed mic, then a voice with the plain vowels of a person who never moved away from county lines. The man said, "Recording starts now," then counted off time the way divers do when they want witnesses later. The hiss of water followed, with a hollow knock like an oar catching a ladder. Ria tapped a notepad and wrote, "Lake intake, maintenance crew, late summer." She preferred notes to memory because notes never tried to impress anyone. The voice returned with an update that felt almost scripted, and he said the police have cleared the North Shore and no one wants to check the culvert. He added that the marker buoy drifted during last week's storm, which would confuse people using the old map rather than the fresh survey. Ria paused the deck and stared at nothing. Then she wrote, "This is not training audio." She listened again while the deck began to wobble a little, as if it felt nervous. The man on the tape called a second person by name, which Ria wrote as Reed, though it could have been Reed, and asked for a tow line length in the book. Papers rustled in a way that sounded practiced, like they had been rustled for microphones before. The second voice was younger and annoyingly cheerful, and he read a number that did not match a chart Ria remembered from a digitized manual. She looked up the manual in a folder and confirmed the discrepancy while the tape kept turning. The complication grew through small things that did not agree with each other, which is how real messes usually announce themselves. A splash came with no shouting, then a calm description that a scooter had bumped something that was probably a log. Another voice off mic said 30 paces northwest from the pier, which would only make sense to people who used sneakers to measure water. Ria paused and wrote, "Witness statements use paces. Training crews do not." Then she tapped the counter and kept the deck running. The tape cut to a later time without warning, and the man spoke in a lower register and said the family brought a photo. He said the deputy discouraged showing it, then added that the mother insisted because she believed the jacket would reflect light underwater. A woman spoke near the mic and asked if the current would push clothing into the reeds, and someone answered with a line that felt rehearsed by memory rather than by training cards. Rhea stopped the deck and stared through the glass into the quiet stacks. Then she wrote, "Reported missing teen in 1998, probable night swim." She did not know that case personally, but people in her building remembered headlines that arrived 2 summers before the county fair built a second gate. She pulled the archive software and typed terms that felt respectful and cautious, then broadened the search when nothing appeared in scanning range. The first hit was a brief that used the phrase after-hours lake access and urged parents to discuss fences, which sounded like a committee report disguised as news. The second hit was a note about a grant for new lights along the East Path, which suggested some officials had learned a lesson. Ria listened while reading because she had learned to keep both rivers running without spilling knowledge between them. The man on the tape said the outflow grate was secured with a chain that lost one link, then spelled the number into the mic. He said a diver named Reed would check under the skimmer in case a current created a pocket. Someone coughed, and the sound carried like a hallway, which told Ria the recording moved indoors for a moment, probably into the pump house. She stopped the deck and called the public safety office through the desk phone because she preferred clean lines when tape started speaking like living people. The clerk transferred her to a sergeant who kept his voice flat, and he told her there had been many training tapes over the years. He said storage procedures were not always followed, then asked which lake facility label appeared on the shell. She read the letters and silence followed. Then he said he would send an email so everything stayed orderly. Rhea saved the audio to a drive with a date and words and wrote a note that asked for retention guidance, which protected her later. While she waited, she listened again and started catching small textures she missed before, like the way reeds snap near a shoreline when pulled straight out of mud. The man described a sneaker with a broken lace loop, and then he reported the make of a lighter found below the pier that matched several described in earlier calls. He kept saying reportedly and according to people on scene, which sounded careful enough to make a person suspicious. The investigation pushed her out of the room and into places that smelled different, which is how she knew it was working. She walked to the old photo and map drawers past the genealogy corner and pulled a laminated lake grid from the early 2000s that showed markers before the storms moved the buoys. The North Shore marker had 3 possible placements depending on survey year, and the tape described a search pattern that matched the oldest one. She wrote that misplacement would pull a sweep away from the culvert by several yards during a clockwise pattern. Rhea checked the dispatch book that the clerk kept for walk-in requests, and she asked for the log around the week she guessed from the grant article. The book was clean where it mattered and messy where it did not, which is how real logs behave when they are used rather than polished. Several calls mentioned a late-night figure seen near the maintenance gate, and one call specified a tall person wearing a reflective vest that did not match city issue. The vest detail caught her attention because people remember shiny things when they feel useless bystanders. She went to the bait shop at the road bend because people who sell minnows remember who buys coffee the morning after an ugly night. The owner was Tamsin Duarte in 58, with a strong memory for weather fronts and weak patience for tourists. When Rhea asked about North Shore nights from a certain summer, Tamsin cut her off and said people still parked on the service road to drink and break bottles. Then she added a name quietly. Tamsin said a park supervisor called Corley used to sit on the hood and lecture kids about life, though nobody asked. The name did not appear in the tape, but small towns prefer a rotating cast in the same old play. Rhea checked a directory in the library office and found a Corley under Parks with a middle initial and a retirement date in 2007. She called the number listed and reached a house sitter who said the man had moved south for better joints, which sounded reasonable. She left no message and wrote a line that asked if Corley ever held keys to the pump house after hours, then underlined it. The deck resumed chewing while she read, and the man on the tape grew more precise, as if he knew the mic would be his memory. He said the grate was clear and the scooter had not found anything new, then asked Reed to try the intake lip again. He added that the mother asked about the jacket again and whether dye would spread from the fabric, which sounded like a thought returned to after anxiety chewed it thin. The woman said she had seen a store video of the jacket that week, which told Rhea the incident had a concrete timeline. Rhea pulled the police scanner archive that the library kept on an old server because nobody could agree on legal disposal, and she searched for mentions of the brand. A scanner summary from late summer of 1998 included a clerk report about a young buyer who paid in coins and smiled at nothing. The same summary mentioned a second caller who said a man in a Parks vest argued with a boy on the east path near the lockbox. The timing lined up with the grant discussion about lights, which tied the city's sudden interest to the noise around the lake. The twist showing itself was not a single aha, because that belongs to movies that need curtains. It was a set of small corners that fit together when pushed with patient hands. Rhea realized the tape sounded like a real-time memory created for someone who was not at the scene, likely a supervisor who needed consistent detail later. The repeated phrases and spelled-out numbers matched how people build an alibi they can safely repeat without emotion. The note on the shell felt like a message to that specific person, a plain way to say, "This is yours and you know why." She rewound the tape to the early mention of the drifted buoy, then she pulled an aerial photo set from the state survey that sat in a drawer. The week after the storms, a maintenance record said the buoy was returned to the older anchor by a small crew without a diver on site. If that were true, the inner sweep of a clockwise pattern would miss the culvert mouth during the first pass, which a clever person might count on. She tried the geometry with a pencil on tracing paper and saw a shallow cone opening exactly where a current would pocket light plastic. Rhea went back to Tamsin and asked if anyone ever found a jacket that fooled a search, and the woman stared a long time. Tamsin said a teen found something pale tangled in reeds the following spring, but the deputy told him to leave it and call. The item was gone when they returned, and the kids stopped talking about it after a meeting with a parks official in a corner booth. Tamsin said she did not like how the official smiled at the end. Then she told Rhea to be careful with old tapes because they roll out like rope in water. She shared a summary with the sergeant by email, using careful words that respected the difference between suspicion and proof. He called rather than write back, which told her he took the summary seriously enough to avoid records for the moment. He said the department had a thin folder with a waterlogged scooter note and a few statements, and he had always believed the sweep pattern was sloppy more than sinister. Rhea said the tape sounded like planned narration for absent ears, and the sergeant stayed quiet long enough to make his thoughts obvious. The payoff finally arrived in the smallest possible way, because people rarely confess in grand gestures when they can do it in shorthand. At minute 40 of the tape, the man lowered his voice and said, "Reed, tell Corley this marker is for the training reel." Then he spelled an odd sequence. It sounded like letters mixed with numbers, which Rhea first took as a buoy code until she remembered a note in the archives about maintenance padlocks. City padlocks used a shared code that changed each spring, and the tape included a similar pattern with 2 digits swapped. She checked padlock logs that were still on paper because privacy rules kept the spreadsheet in another building, and the pattern matched the east padlock from that summer. The swapped digits would open the maintenance gate without leaving a standard key entry, which would make late-night arrivals look like routine trips in the morning. The person who needed that information was not a diver or a deputy, but a park supervisor who liked to sit on hoods and pretend to mentor children. Rhea played the end again and wrote that the tape was a message, not a record of good work under pressure. The line "this tape was not meant for you" was probably aimed at anyone outside a small circle who might later hear it by accident. Corley retired in 2007 with commendations for hours served, which was a different metric from the one that matters in the quiet presence of water. The teen on the Grant timeline vanished from the archive after a few weeks, and the paper changed topics the way papers do when people stop calling. She turned in her notes to the sergeant and asked for a receipt because she understood how institutional memory leaks through cracks when nobody labels boxes. He said he would log the audio as potential evidence, even if the statute road was unclear, and he thanked her for resisting the story-shaped shortcuts. She felt tired in a way that would not fix itself with coffee, and she stopped the deck with her thumb resting on the button longer than needed. On her way home, she pulled into the park and sat in the lot without climbing out. Then she watched a gull bully a sandwich bag. The lake wore its afternoon wind, the way old glass carries waves inside, and she thought about objects that travel farther than people plan. She pictured a jacket catching on a grate, then releasing after weeks. Then she pictured a vest reflecting just right in a corner eye on a dark path. She said nothing to anyone because there was nothing to say that would not become a speech, and speeches never fix water. Later that week, the sergeant called and said the department would reopen a file enough to review procedures from that season. He did not say the word case, and he did not say closure, which she respected. He asked if she would burn a clean copy of the audio with no EQ adjustments, and she said yes because the original was theirs now. She returned to her desk and labeled a disc with careful letters. Then she slid it into an envelope that carried a little static when sealed. She kept one personal note in her drawer that read, "Listen for the words people repeat when they want to be believed." The tape had taught her that patterns are not only for divers and surveyors, but also for liars who fear their own imaginations. She recorded that thought in her daybook and closed it with the last of her calm. Then she put the next cassette in the deck. Someone had written North Dam Inventory on the shell, which sounded refreshingly dull. That night, she drove past the bait shop and waved at Tamsin without stopping. Then she took the long way around toward the public beach. The markers shone without drama, and the path lights hummed with a noise the city would ignore until a budget meeting. Rhea parked by the picnic area and walked to the fence where the service road ended. Then she watched the chain on the gate while cars passed behind her. It had a new lock with a digital face and a sticker that said "City Issue" and nothing more. She returned to her car and wrote one last line on a napkin, so the thought would not echo through sleep and turn into something else. She wrote the tape reached the wrong hands on purpose years later because objects look for the people who will understand them. It was never meant for the public or the paper or the desk with the humming lights. It was meant for a single person who knew a code and loved arrangements. The lake accepted every plan without comment, then it kept its own quiet notes until someone listened with stubborn attention. In the following weeks, the library received a small budget lift earmarked for media preservation, which made Rhea feel both pleased and uneasy. The sergeant stopped by and left 2 donuts that tasted like remorse trying to be kindness, which she appreciated. He said the department had interviewed a few long-retired staff members who remembered a supervisor with a talent for showing up during good photo moments, then leaving before real work began. He did not promise new conclusions, which was the correct move. Rhea finished the carton that started the day, then she shelved the empty box with a clear label that included dates and full words. She had learned to keep history gentle but firm, like a hand holding a shoulder before a hard sentence. She believed the tape would survive now, whether as a footnote or an exhibit or a quiet lesson in training rooms. She believed the jacket probably never reflected enough light to matter, but it had helped a mother keep hold of a shape while others built their own. On a calm morning, weeks later, she sat by the lake with coffee and listened to the small mechanical whir inside her own recorder. She sometimes captured ambient sound to clean her ears between sad projects, and the gulls performed like they were paid in bread. A child laughed from the playground, and a dog shook water from its coat, and the fence creaked with the weight of a sleepy worker leaning to check a latch. Rhea lifted her mic, then lowered it, and decided this moment did not need a track and a label because not every memory belongs to the archive. She drove back to work and unlocked the quiet room. Then she placed the lake tape in a drawer that took 2 keys to open. The message had found an unintended reader, and the circle had widened by an inch, which was sometimes the only ethical way to widen circles. She wrote one careful note in the catalog that said voices describe a search using drifted markers and misremembered charts, reportedly to inform an absent supervisor. The stories. Motel room key log raised a warning at noon. The motel stood behind a tired strip mall where the highway bent east, and the room key log flagged a warning at noon. The manager said it had never done that for a single guest before, and the front desk software timestamp looked clean. Tamsin Rourke was 38, and she worked as a freelance transcriptionist who liked quiet rooms near highways. She checked in after a morning dental appointment, and she asked for a corner room away from the ice machine. Her plan was simple and forgettable, and she would upload 2 interviews before dinner without distractions. She had a cheap grocery salad chilling in the mini fridge, and she set her laptop near the lamp. The incident started when she left for a quick walk along the frontage road, and she returned before lunch. The red light on the lock blinked twice when she placed her key. And then the handle felt sticky for a second. She slid the key again, and the green light appeared, and the door opened without resistance. Something in the room felt slightly wrong, and her neat habits made that feeling hard to dismiss. Her notebook sat an inch off its earlier square alignment, and the privacy latch hung down at a different angle. The remote was upside down on the bed runner, and the curtains were parted just enough to show the lot. She did not panic, and she checked the window first, then the bathroom, then the closet. Nothing obvious was missing, and nothing valuable looked disturbed, and the safe still clicked with the same code. The manager, a steady man named Karim Doss with a careful way of talking, came up with a portable printer. He said the lock system kept an audit trail, and he could print the last 50 entries for peace of mind. He pressed a button on the encoder box, and a strip of paper fed out with lines that looked like a receipt. He pointed at a line that read, "Warning at 12:00, and he frowned at the code beside it. Karim said the warning usually meant repeated wrong keys, or a master key used in the wrong sequence. He asked whether she had trouble at the door, and she said the first swipe was odd, but it finally worked. He said housekeeping had not reached the swing yet, and the schedule showed rooms 5 through 10 blocked for later. He also said maintenance had no work orders near her room, and the pool pump had their focus today. Tamsin asked for a copy of the printout, and he tore the strip carefully and handed it to her. He said the desk software would mirror the entries, and the access times should match the paper record. He offered to change her room, and she said she preferred to stay if he could figure out the timing. She needed to finish her files, and moving would cost an hour of careful setup that already worked. He left to check the system downstairs, and she began a small investigation with habits learned from years of odd jobs. She took pictures of the desk layout, and she wrote down the position of the remote and notebook. She opened the fridge and felt the salad lid, and condensation traced the shape of her thumb. She photographed the hallway from her doorway, and she watched the corner mirror for anyone watching her room. Her phone showed an unknown missed call at 11:59, and the voicemail held only air and a soft tap. The timestamp placed the call 1 minute before noon, and that matched the printed warning by chance or design. She saved the file and wrote voicemail at 11:59 on a sticky note, then kept going. She recorded a short clip of the lock blinking pattern, and she took a still of the latch angle. Karyam returned with a more complex explanation, and he looked both apologetic and curious. He said the central software showed 4 events around noon, and 2 were standard heartbeat checks. He said the third line was the warning, and the fourth line was her successful entry. He said the heartbeat checks were normal, and his vendor insisted those never touched the door memory. She asked who else had access to the master keys, and he listed his assistant and the head housekeeper. He said the shift had started late because of a staffing issue, and nobody had departed the laundry room until after the storm warning cleared. He looked out the window for a second, and the clouds were breaking over the lot. He said he could pull camera footage of the hall, and he offered to show her right away. They stood in a back office that smelled like detergent, and a small monitor rendered yesterday like a shaky stage. The hallway camera faced the vending alcove, and her door showed only as a sliver to the right. She could see the housekeeping cart parked across from a stairwell, and the garbage bag over its handle moved like a slow flag. She could also see the timestamp in the corner, and it froze now and then. Karyam scrubbed to 11:58, and the hallway stayed empty except for a flicker near her door. He paused and rewound, and the ghost of a reflection crossed the chrome of the vending machine. The time stamped 12:00 when a shadow fell across the carpet, and then the monitor hiccuped through 4 frames. When it recovered, the cart stood an inch closer to the stairwell, and a candy bar wrapper twitched near the baseboard. He said the recorder sometimes skipped frames when the network hiccuped, and the storm probably did that earlier too. He said he would export the clip for backup, and he pressed a key that made the machine work. He printed another lock log at the front desk, and he noticed the codes looked different than the hallway printer. He muttered that the right column no longer showed the same vendor identifiers. Then he shrugged. Tamsin stayed gentle but persistent, and she asked for the front desk call records for the last 2 hours. He logged into the phone system and printed a list, and the sheet showed her incoming call at 11:59. He said the number looked like a regional call center trunk, and he did not recognize the exchange. He also pointed to a call from housekeeping to the desk at 11:47, and the note field read linens. She walked back to the room and pushed the privacy latch up, and she placed a glass against the door to hold it steady. She laid the 2 printouts side by side and traced the times with a pen, and she felt the rhythm of a pattern. The warning line sat like a pivot between routine checks, and the voicemail landed like a pebble against glass. She put her ear to the door and listened for wheels, then returned to the desk. Her own notes from the morning had a small clue that now felt louder, and she leaned into it. The motel website had listed check-in at 3, and the desk allowed 11 that day after a phone request. She remembered the clerk saying the system was fussy about early openings, and he had to enable the room manually. She asked whether that action wrote to the door, and he had said it usually did not write outside the server. She decided to create a timeline using what she had, and she kept her sentences short inside her head. She wrote walk begins at 11:25, and she wrote return at 11:58 by phone clock. She marked unknown call at 11:59, and she marked warning at noon per log. She marked successful entry after noon, and she left a space under the hallway camera skip. She started checking external sources that could anchor the minute hand, and she searched for weather alerts. The city office had posted a gust advisory that morning, and the timestamp read 11:49 on the archive page. The motel shared the notice on a social feed, and that repost time read 11:52. She noted those times and circled the hallway camera skip, then took another breath. 2 doors down, a long-term guest named Felton Jarvie stepped out with a laundry bag, and he watched her writing with polite curiosity. He wore a maintenance polo from a utility company, and his hands were clean in a careful way. He asked if everything was all right, and she said the door log showed a warning while she was gone. He said he heard a tap near noon from her door, and he thought it was someone knocking softly. Felton told her he had walked past the vending alcove at 11:55, and the housekeeping cart was not there then. He said the head housekeeper usually parked by the elevator, and moving the cart to the stairwell meant a quick run. He said the stairwell door sometimes stuck in humid weather, and people jiggled it with hip or shoulder. He offered that detail without drama, and he returned to his laundry with a nod. She wrote, "Witness heard soft tap near noon," and she wrote, "Cart location changed between 11:55 and noon." She returned to the office and asked Karyem whether any staff used the stairwell before lunch. He said the head housekeeper clocked a call to the desk for linens at 11:47, and she likely went down the stairs to the supply room. He said he could ask her directly, and he picked up the radio. The head housekeeper, a brisk woman named Vina Ortega, arrived with a ring of keys and an honest face. She said she did not touch room 9 that morning, and she stayed focused on laundry because 2 new hires were out. She said she parked the cart by the stairwell at around 11:56, and she ran down for pillowcases. She said she saw a man on the landing who said he was looking for the ice machine. Vina described the man in a way that felt practical, and Tamsin wrote each point without rushing. He wore a light jacket with a stitched logo that looked like a mountain, and he carried a slim plastic folder. He kept his head down when he passed her, and he said something like, "Sorry, wrong turn," in a low voice. Vina said she did not see him after that moment, and she returned with pillowcases within 2 minutes. Karyem asked whether the man entered any rooms, and Vina said no with a clear shake of her head. She added that the folder looked like those carriers used by sales reps who drop off rate sheets, and she shrugged. Tamsin asked if any vendors had appointments scheduled around noon, and Karyem checked a clipboard near the computer. He said a door lock vendor had promised a firmware push window this week, and the note read, "Watch for noon checks." He called the vendor number from the contract, and a recorded line explained a service window had occurred overnight earlier that week. The recording mentioned that local controllers might resynchronize during the next heartbeat, and some systems would show noon test entries. It said the entries should not appear as warnings, and any warning codes indicated a local misconfiguration with time settings. Karyem put the phone down slowly and exhaled. This turned the printed warning into something less mysterious and more technical, and yet the soft tap and shifted items remained. Tamsin asked whether the motel had shifted clocks recently, and he said they had updated everything after a power blink in late spring. He said the head housekeeper never touched the controller closet, and only he and the assistant manager had the key. He said the assistant was off-site today, and the key hung in his pocket. Tamsin asked for the stairwell camera if available, and he said that stairwell lacked coverage by an inch of budget. She asked whether a rear door camera covered the bottom of those stairs, and he nodded with measured relief. They pulled up the rear camera, and a narrow view showed the delivery alley and a sliver of the stairwell door. The timestamp now froze less often, and the light shifted across an oil stain like a lazy sundial. At 11:58 by the camera clock, the stairwell door opened just enough to spill a thin triangle of light. A figure in a light jacket stepped into the frame, and the stitched logo matched Vina's description by shape. He held a slim plastic folder against his side, and the posture looked like someone carrying documents that should not bend. He walked toward the alley exit, and he kept his head angled away from the lens. Karyem printed the clip details and wrote down the frame references, and he looked grateful for the anchor. He called the city non-emergency line and reported a suspicious trespass with time and description, and he received a reference number. Tamsin stayed in the office while he spoke, and she scanned the clip again for details that might connect. The jacket logo looked familiar, and she leaned closer to the screen. She remembered a flyer in the lobby about avalanche readiness training from a regional outdoor store, and the mountain logo resembled that brand. She found a photo of the flyer in her morning snapshots, and the triangles of the logo matched in a crude way. She wrote possible brand match on her notes, and then she reconsidered the cleaner explanation. She asked whether any delivery drivers wore similar jackets from a local supplier. Karyem said a laundry service delivered on Tuesdays, and their shirts had a wave rather than a peak. He said a copier technician had visited last month, and his vest reflected light in bright stripes. He also said a door lock vendor rep had visited in 2019, and that rep carried a thin folder and spoke softly. He pointed to an old business card taped inside a drawer, and the logo on the card was a shield. Tamsin returned to the voicemail and listened again, and the soft tap in the recording felt more like a brushed microphone. She increased the playback speed, and the hiss changed pattern, and the tap now sounded like a door meeting a frame. She looked at the lock and imagined someone swiping a card and bumping the door with a shoulder, then backing off. The warning at noon could align with an invalid swipe, and the soft tap could be that bump. She compared the hallway camera skip with the rear camera movement, and a pattern gained weight. The hallway camera froze near noon, exactly when the stairwell door opened downstairs, and the network load could explain that. The housekeeping cart shift lined up with Vina jogging to the supply room, and the man could have slipped past as she turned. The voicemail hit her phone as the man reached the bottom door, and the network jitter added noise. She also checked her own photos from the morning, and one showed the privacy latch at a different angle before she left. The after image showed the latch touching a scuff on the frame, and the before image left a finger of space. That meant someone likely opened the door enough to disturb the latch, then reset it with an unfamiliar hand. The remote upside down could be a subtle cue of a rushed search or simply clumsy housekeeping. The twist arrived when she noticed the line at the very top of the first printout, and she traced it with her pen. The header used a 2-letter time zone label that did not match the server region, and the offset would shift noon by 1 hour. The rear camera time showed one set of minutes, and the hallway printer showed another set on a slightly different clock. That meant the warning at noon really pointed to 11, and her walk covered that window. She told Karyam that the warning might mask an entry a few minutes earlier, and he nodded slowly as the idea settled. He pulled the controller settings and found a daylight rule applied twice, and the vendor menu allowed only one checkbox. He disabled the duplicate flag and printed a fresh log, and the warning line now read 11:58 after correction. That timestamp matched the voicemail and the rear camera movement on the dot. With the corrected time, the man in the jacket appeared at the stairs exactly when her door reacted, and the picture sharpened. Vina confirmed her quick run for pillowcases at 11:56 by wristwatch memory, and Felton's soft knock memory seemed solid enough. Karyam called the non-emergency line again with the refined time and the clearer description, and the dispatcher thanked him for the update. Later that afternoon, a patrol unit stopped by and reviewed the printed clips and the fixed audit trail, and they asked simple questions. They said a regional scam had targeted small motels by posing as vendor reps, and the goal was to test doors for forgotten valuables. They said the suspects favored just checked rooms with early occupancy, and a front desk distraction sometimes played a part. They took the folder details and the logo sketch and said they would file a report. Tamsin finished her interviews with the door double-latched, and she kept one eye on the hallway mirror when grabbing ice. She moved her wallet to the safe and spread her notes across the desk, and the scene felt accountable now. She typed a short summary with exact times and saved every photo twice, and she kept the lock printouts flat under the clip. She handed copies to Karyam before dinner, and he thanked her in a tired voice. Before she slept, she replayed the day with a practical mind, and she measured her fears against the evidence. The door lock warning at noon had sounded alarming and mysterious, and the correction removed some dramatic weight. The network's skips created suspicion, yet they explained themselves when matched with weather alerts and stairwell footage. The man in the jacket had moved like a test rather than a charge, and his exit suggested caution over violence. The next morning, a call from the dispatcher confirmed a minor break at another motel, and the description matched the jacket and folder. They said nobody was hurt, and they had recovered a similar audit trail with the same duplicate daylight setting. They asked for permission to retain Karyam's clips for training, and he agreed after printing a release form. The report would remain bland and useful, and that felt right for everyone involved. Tamsin returned the key at the desk and asked for a printed receipt with checkout time, and she tucked it carefully away. Karyam had fixed the controller settings and ordered a second camera for the stairwell, and he looked relieved. He said he would schedule a vendor review of the master key sequence, and he promised to retrain the desk on early room openings. He thanked her again for being patient and methodical, and his posture finally eased. She drove away with the highway steady and uncomplicated, and the motel shrank in the rear view until it was another box. She told herself that most mysteries feel bigger when unnamed, and this one had a tidy frame now. The log had raised a warning at noon, yet the truth landed minutes earlier, and the whole story hung by a misaligned clock. She kept the copies in a folder labeled Motel Room Audit, and she let the day be ordinary again. The stories. Why locals avoided that highway turnout after archived tapes? For years, people driving the old state highway between two small towns avoided a certain turnout near mile marker 91. The place looked harmless enough, a cracked patch of asphalt with a slanted guardrail, some weeds, and a broken streetlight. But those who grew up nearby said that if you stopped there at night, strange things happened. Back in 1996, a highway maintenance worker named Travis Keene was assigned to inspect storm drains along that stretch. He was 38, lived alone, and usually did his rounds before sunrise to avoid heavy traffic. That February morning, he radioed his supervisor around 4:20 a.m., saying he had stopped at the turnout near the ridge because a culvert there was flooded. It was the last transmission anyone heard from him. When the crew came later that day, they found his truck idling, driver's door open, and his flashlight lying in the ditch. His radio was still on the seat, buzzing with static. At first, they thought maybe he slipped and fell into the drainage pit, but search teams combed the area for 3 days with dogs and found nothing. The official report listed him as missing. In early spring that year, a state trooper found a small cassette recorder wedged under the passenger seat of Keene's truck. The tape was partially damaged by moisture, but audio engineers later salvaged parts of it. What they heard caused the highway department to quietly close that turnout for several months. Only fragments of the tape were ever released, though copies circulated among troopers and local reporters. On the tape, Keene's voice could be heard describing the flooded culvert and making notes for his report. He mentioned hearing a sound like running water even though the drainage was still. Then there was a pause, followed by the crunch of gravel and a faint metallic knocking, as if something were striking the guardrail. He muttered that someone must be out there. Moments later, his tone changed. He whispered that a figure was standing at the end of the turnout, near his truck lights, motionless. The rest of the tape dissolved into static, then a few seconds of muffled breathing, then silence. Investigators checked the surrounding land for any sign of trespassers. The nearest houses were half a mile away, and nobody reported hearing or seeing anything unusual that night. Still, the highway patrol logged several late-night calls over the next month from drivers who said they saw flashing lights or a person standing in the road waving them down near that same marker. When officers arrived, nothing was ever there. In 2002, a retired dispatcher named Loretta Vance told a local paper she had archived several of the old emergency tapes from that period. She said she remembered one specific call that never made it into the public file. According to her, a truck driver had radioed in saying there was a man in a reflective vest near the turnout signaling for help. By the time a patrol unit arrived 8 minutes later, the truck driver was gone. His rig was found 3 miles down the road, engine off, lights on, and the door locked from the inside. He was later located at a diner 20 miles away, confused and unable to recall leaving the cab. Reporters tried to verify her memory through the department's records office, but several of the call logs from 1996 through 1998 were missing, apparently lost during a server migration. Still, copies of the Keene tape surfaced online around 2011 after someone uploaded a restored version from an old police archive. Audio specialists claimed the frequency hiss on the track shifted in a way that suggested outdoor interference, like shortwave bleed or power line distortion, though no transmission lines ran near that turnout. A freelance investigator named Aaron Byers, who once worked for the State Transport Division, conducted his own study of the site in 2017. He took soil and water samples and found nothing unusual except traces of magnetized iron particles near the guardrail. He speculated that the metallic knocking Keene mentioned could have been the sound of loose signage vibrating from wind gusts. However, his field recorder picked up a faint, rhythmic pulse whenever his car engine was idling near the slope, a pattern that matched the timing of the static bursts on Keene's tape. Locals told Byers that animals often avoided that patch of asphalt. Drivers noticed deer crossing farther down the road and stray dogs turning away before the curve. One witness, a postal carrier named Darlene Ruiz, said she once stopped there to fix a loose mirror and saw what looked like a headlight beam flicker across the inside of her car, even though no vehicle was approaching. She left immediately, and later noticed her clock had jumped ahead 12 minutes. Her phone's timestamp showed the same gap. The county eventually restructured the route in 2020, adding new lanes that bypassed the turnout completely. The old guardrail was removed, though pieces of it remained piled in a maintenance yard behind the highway office. Some claim that late at night, if you drive along the parallel service road, you can still see faint taillights hovering where the old pavement used to curve. Over time, the keen disappearance became part of regional folklore, filed next to old mine accidents and bridge collapse rumors, yet certain details kept resurfacing, like the archived dispatcher notes that matched later reports, or the fact that multiple tapes contained the same background hum. A few amateur sleuths suggested it was a recording artifact caused by cheap equipment, but no one could explain why the distortion always rose in pitch before the moment of silence. In 2023, a hobbyist group using drone-mounted sensors mapped the ridge for a documentary. They detected an underground cavity, roughly 12 feet beneath the turnout site, extending toward the nearby creek. Geological experts said it was probably an erosion tunnel formed by runoff, though it wasn't present in surveys from the 1980s. The cavity collapsed a few months later after heavy rain, leaving a sinkhole that swallowed part of the service fence. No trace of Travis Keene or his equipment was ever found in that area, but a later inventory from the transport department listed one missing flood gauge and a handheld magnetometer, both last signed out under his name. Today, older residents still tell travelers not to pull over between marker 90 and marker 92. They say sometimes, when the air is heavy with moisture and the road hums beneath your tires, you can hear faint tapping, like metal brushing metal, and a low voice reporting water levels into an old cassette recorder. Whether that's just echo carried from the nearby drainage tunnels or something else entirely remains uncertain. What's clear is that no one in town stops at that turnout anymore. The stories might be exaggerated, but every legend begins somewhere, and this one began with a man who simply vanished while doing his job. One quiet morning in 1996, the stories. Paramedic who returned a ring to the ranger station. He found the ring beneath a bench outside the ranger station after a thunderstorm cleared and left everything smelling like pennies. The inscription was shallow from wear, yet legible enough to stop him cold before he tossed it in Lost and Found. His name was Daryl Keene, 32, paramedic on the rural night unit that parked near the station between calls. He had clocked out late and planned to drive home for eggs and sleep, nothing heavier than traffic and weather. The ring was small, silver, scuffed, with 4 letters etched inside that did not match any brand he recognized. He wiped it on his shirt, felt ridiculous superstition prickle his neck, then reminded himself that metal was just metal. He walked into the station lobby, where the maps curled at the edges, and flyers begged hikers to sign trail registers. The clerk on duty that morning was a seasonal hire named Isabel Rusk, 26, wildlife biology graduate and coffee loyalist. She wrote the ring in the inventory ledger, asked his phone number for a courtesy call, and slid it into a tray. Dario left a note by instinct, a paramedic habit, logging time and location and weather in case someone asked later. Out in the parking lot, he replayed last night, which featured a stranded camper with mild hypothermia and a false alarm. He could not shake the ring, which was strange, because he usually forgot objects once they were filed and numbered. On his day off, he cut through town for groceries and noticed a poster at the laundromat that mentioned a missing ring. The page was sun-warped and stapled crooked, with a photocopied hand and the same 4 letters circled in black pen. The contact tear slip was gone, but a name remained that matched an old Ranger call sign he knew from dispatch. He remembered hearing it during training, tucked into an anecdote about a search several winters before he joined the unit. Back at his apartment, he opened a plastic tote where he kept spiral notebooks filled with patient notes and road observations. He used them to steady his head when night shifts stacked up and details blurred into one long siren-haunted ribbon. He flipped through a winter notebook and found an entry about a storm closure at the North Ridge trailhead near mile marker. There was a scribble about a reported vehicle in the lot after midnight, and a reference to archived calls marked cold case. The four letters matched the poster and the notebook, and his stomach tightened like he had stepped into empty air unexpectedly. He told himself it was coincidence. Then he looked again at the handwriting and knew he would not sleep without checking. He drove to the station and asked for Isabel, who had just come off trail crew support and smelled faintly like pine cleaner. She retrieved the tray, confirmed the ledger entry, and admitted that the ring already drew a call from a withheld number. The caller reportedly asked whether the inscription was intact, then hung up when she offered the standard lost property procedure. Isabel shrugged and said weird things find the station every year, then asked why he looked like he had swallowed a tack. Daryl explained the poster and his notes, careful with phrasing, avoiding names and exact dates that might tag private people. He asked whether the old Ranger call sign meant anything to her, and she frowned like a person trying to remember a ringtone. She typed on a terminal that still beeped like an old cash register and pulled up a thin incident summary from past seasons. The report mentioned a volunteer ranger named Lyle Witt, mid-40s, seen last signing out to check a flooded culvert. Witness statements suggested he turned off the main road to assist a motorist in a heavy rain that erased tire tracks. Final footage from a highway maintenance camera showed headlights near the ridge turnout, then heavy static as wind battered the lens. The four letters in the ring inscription matched his initials and a nickname the volunteer used on old trail day signboards. The summary ended with a note that the vehicle and the volunteer were not recovered despite grid searches and river scans. Daryl felt the room narrow, which happened to him on difficult scenes when he needed to pick the next useful action. He asked whether they ever collected personal property from that area, and Isabel said most recovered items turned up much later. She added that spring melt exposes things that winter hides, and lost metal often travels far in culverts and channels. Daryl asked to sign a witness statement, which felt strange, since his only act had been bending for a glint under a bench. He described the find with plain details, like distance from the threshold and position of the bench slats and water stains. He included the weather and the timestamp from his phone, then he photographed the ledger page with permission for his records. On his way out, he noticed a corkboard with dryer lint textures of flyers, including one about historic flood years and culvert maintenance. A little printed square described a storm nearly 20 years back that undercut the ridge road and formed a temporary sinkhole. The line about road repairs matched a rumor he had heard on overnight radio, the sort of thing callers debate between traffic updates. He took a photo of the square and wrote down the maintenance contact number, then drove home feeling like the ground rode along. That evening, he called the maintenance office and reached a supervisor named Raleigh Dim, 51, veteran of patchwork and paperwork. Raleigh remembered the volunteer by call sign and said the guy reportedly once welded a broken gate hinge on his lunch hour. He explained that the ridge turnout drained into a service culvert that emptied into an old arroyo behind a shuttered campground. He added that a private tow company once pulled an abandoned sedan from a side basin during late summer, then misplaced the paperwork. Daryl asked whether the county kept disposal receipts, and Raleigh said archived bills lived in a warehouse that smelled like motor oil. He offered to meet the next morning with access to the paper stacks if Daryl did not mind dust and swearing at faded ink. They met in a low building whose metal roof pinged when gulls landed, and Raleigh rolled out a ladder and a cart with binders. Daryl paged through invoices and found a line item for a recovered vehicle from the ridge vicinity after a storm year. The receipt lacked a plate number, which set his teeth on edge, but it listed a description that matched the volunteer's truck. A handwritten note in the margin directed the tow company to hold personal effects for a claim that never arrived or cleared. Daryl used his phone to scan the page, then asked Raleigh whether the side basin ever got dredged for heavy debris after storms. Raleigh nodded and said they tried, but the basin had pockets where things settled deep and stayed quiet until a new season. Back at the station, Isabel took the scanned receipt and added it to a folder that had begun to resemble a small case file. She called the number from the old poster just in case, and it rang to a voicemail that no longer accepted messages. They agreed not to speculate out loud, which is how responsible people hold a line between curiosity and harm to private families. Instead, they requested access to dispatch logs from that storm week, using internal email channels and precise language about inventory continuity. The logs showed multiple calls reporting a stalled vehicle and disappearing taillights near the ridge turnout around the same time. One archived call captured a voice asking if the station had a spare chain, then cutting out as thunder rolled over everything. Dario listened and felt a human scale of time, the way a minute expands when weather takes over and simple plans collapse. He thought about why the ring would end up under the bench unless someone placed it, then pictured stormwater spreading like a net. Isabel checked the station exterior and found a grill over a drain that emptied near the bench after long downhill runs. She traced the channel on the maintenance map and saw a path from the arroyo through a culvert that cut beneath the parking lot. It sounded improbable at first, then they considered how small objects ride water differently than larger debris during heavy flow. A ring could slip past grates like a coin tossed to luck, then settle where turbulence died and janitors swept after hours. They walked the route during daylight and marked scuff lines from past flows, following pebbles like breadcrumbs to the station edge. At a low grate, they found a snag of twigs and a strip of cloth that might be from a work shirt pocket. Isabel bagged the cloth and labeled it for possible testing, though neither expected much, and both respected quiet possibilities. They logged locations and took photos from eye level and boot level, then stored everything in the folder that felt heavier daily. That night, a withheld number called the station again and left a message that asked whether the initials were still visible. The voice sounded older and careful, and the caller reportedly asked about stainless versus silver, then thanked someone who had not answered. Daryl suspected a relative who wanted privacy, so he did not push for a callback through caller lookup that might bruise boundaries. Instead, he asked Isabel to post a simple notice that an item was found, with identification proof required and no description. 3 days later, a woman arrived with wind-bitten cheeks and an envelope of photocopies of Trail Day signboards and old photos. She introduced herself as Marnie Witt, 50, postal clerk, and said she believed the ring belonged to someone she once knew. She produced a photocopy of a volunteer roster with initial marks that matched the inscription style and the spacing between letters. She also brought a scanned image of a birthday photo reportedly taken at the station picnic where the ring first appeared on a hand. Isabel followed procedure, asked neutral questions, and requested a description without revealing any difference between steel and silver. Marnie said it was silver and scuffed from manual work, and the letters were done with a cheap engraving pen from a hardware counter. She had no interest in press or drama, only closure regarding a box of things that never found a rightful shelf at home. She did not ask about remains or rumors, and the room felt like a church hallway, with voices quietly minding the floor echo. Daryl watched her study the ring like a person watching weather, accepting change without bargaining. Then she nodded and held it close. She signed the claim form and thanked them for record-keeping, then said she planned to take the ring to a quiet spot and breathe. After she left, Daryl and Isabel sat silently with a folder that could be closed even without answers that win headlines. They updated the file with non-identifying language, noting that the event remained unresolved, but an item found its probable keeper. A week later, Raleigh called to say the warehouse yielded another stack of toe slips that linked the earlier receipt to a dated work order. The order referenced a truck pulled from a side basin near the arroyo, with no occupant listed and disposal recorded after waiting periods. Daryl printed the work order and attached it to the file, then suggested a courtesy memo to the county records office for alignment. The memo included excerpts from dispatch logs, witness statements, and the inventory ledger, written plainly, without speculation or sharp claims. He drove to the turnout that evening and parked where the wind rolled downhill like a waterless river over dry grass. He stood by the newly repaired grate and imagined a ring skipping through stormwater, then settling under a bench as the world dried. On the way back, he stopped at the laundromat and saw the old poster had been removed, the staple holes still marking the cork. He felt relief, and something else that did not have a tidy name, a feeling like finishing a call without losing anyone. At the station, Isabel had taped a small note above the lost and found that read, "Inventory matters, please describe details patiently." Daryl smiled because he knew how patience saved lives on ugly roads, and how tiny facts often carried heavy conclusions silently. He wrote a final entry in his notebook that summarized the chain of events, using timestamps and neutral phrasing like a field report. He listed his own doubts and how they changed, which he did after tough nights, so future him remembered the shape of useful doubt. He drove home and fried eggs and left the radio off, letting the quiet fill in around the edges of the long day. In the morning, he returned to duty and checked his ambulance kit twice, then a third time, because routine confidence keeps hands steady. News never broke big from the ridge, and that felt right. Because families deserve weathered truths without strangers guessing for sport. The station kept the folder in a locked cabinet with a slip that directed any future inquiry to records with gentle formality. When Daryl parked near the bench again, he looked at the drain and thanked the design that nudged a small thing into daylight. He also thanked the habit of writing things down, because memory can bend when nights are long and calls stack like restless waves. He knew the ring did not fix the story, yet it tightened the edges enough to hold, like stitching on a torn sleeve. He decided that returning it mattered regardless of headlines, because care can look like a metal circle resting in a palm. Later, a storm rolled across the hills and the station roof hammered, but the grate held and the lot drained without drama. Daryl watched the water pass the bench and felt steadier than the week before, which is a kind of quiet rescue in itself. He thought about that last highway camera clip that cut out as wind rose, and he hoped the driver knew someone kept looking. He believed that simple custody of small objects carried weight, and he promised himself to keep taking notes when the world blurred. The next week, a handwritten thank you arrived with no return address, just a single sentence about holding grief like a stone. Isabel logged the letter, then placed it in the file where it settled beside receipts and call logs and dry photographs. They closed the cabinet gently, like leaving a campsite clean, and the station returned to business with maps and radios humming. Daryl stepped outside, breathed air that smelled like wet bark, and felt awake enough to meet the next ordinary emergency. He walked past the bench and saw nothing shine, and that unremarkable view felt right, like a road that finally held its line.